Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new series, Critical Thoughts, where we're bringing you people with lived experience who want you to think deeper about how you apply your lived experience in practice, but also how we do better in the suicide prevention sector as a whole. Today's chat is with Amanda, who lost her father to suicide 40 years ago and went on a journey to discover who he was as a person. Her chat with me is really interesting and makes you think about what more could you be doing with your lived experience and to understand how you relate to it and do your work in suicide prevention. So I hope you enjoy our chat as much as I enjoyed chatting with her, and enjoy.
Thanks so much for having a chat with me, Amanda. Really appreciate hearing about your experiences. Um, we plan to have a chat about, writing from lived experience. You have a pretty interesting story to tell. Can you maybe give me a bit of a background about how you came to, writing lived experience in a book?
Yeah, sure, Hayley. So I grew up in the Adelaide Hills in a place called Mount Barker, and I was the youngest of three sisters. And my dad was a police officer. And going back to the time of 1981, he was an inspector or a commissioned officer with SA Police. And yeah, we had the tragic news then that Dad had taken his life by suicide. As I said, well, I was only 9 at the time in 1981, so it's a quite a bit hazy for me to try and go back to that time and think about how it affected me and the impact. But we sort of got through those years. I later went on to become a police officer for many years, and I ended up moving to a country town through my police career. And only about 4 years ago, approximately, so about 2018, 19, a friend of mine sent me a little cutout from a country newspaper, and it had a picture of my dad with one of the previous detectives that he'd worked with in the Adelaide Hills. And it was talking about his friend's semi-retirement, I suppose, how he was running a country caravan park. And I'd never actually seen this photograph myself. And I thought, oh, wow, I've never seen that photo of Dad. I'll see if I can get a copy. So I contacted that local newspaper and I met with the editor of the paper. And it was there that he informed me that back in 1981, he had actually followed Dad's, Dad was missing, and then his body was found. As I said, he'd taken his life. And he had covered that story as a journalist back in 1981. And he had a number of notes, and he started just telling me things about that time and what it was like in SA when Dad was missing and all the steps that were going on. And I suppose it was the first time that I'd started to learn things outside of what I'd learned just from Mum and our inner circle. And so we had this sort of crazy idea that I realized then that I didn't really know my dad. I was in that minute of meeting this editor. I just learned so much. And that sort of made us make a decision that him and myself, he obviously being a journalist, he has a passion for writing, that I wanted to go and meet as many people as I could so that I could actually learn who my dad was through their experiences. So that's how we came to together. We wrote a book.
And what's the book called?
The book's called Whit because my maiden name and Dad's family name was Whitford. So he was Inspector Whitford and everybody referred to him as Whit. So, yeah, pretty simple stuff. And yeah, it basically has different chapters. Pretty well on every person that I interviewed has a chapter about how did they know Whit, what was their experiences together, funny times, sad side times, just really learning. I'd heard that he was a great bloke, but I wanted to know why. So I went and spent a lot of time really, as I put it, meeting my dad through these people.
Yeah. And it sounds like it would have been like a lot of work going around interviewing so many people. And also, it had been some time since your father's death to have to kind of bring up memories and stories of him. What was it kind of like for you going through that process?
Yeah, it was, I had my ups and downs. So sometimes it was really touching where you'd emotionally, like your chest would be up and your head would be high, and you'd be just so proud of what you'd heard of how your dad had carried himself. I suppose there was a lot of emotion when they would remind me of how dad would speak of his family and how much love he had for his girls. And a lot of them had never really met the family closely. They may have known mum through the work shows. They remembered of me, or they remembered seeing me at the funeral, but they'd never had that opportunity to talk to me. So there was quite a lot of really touching moments that they shared. And yes, a lot of them tried to, I suppose, show whether it be sympathy or empathy, um, trying to say, your dad was a great bloke and we feel for you. And I suppose that was never my intent. It wasn't to go around and seek attention. It was to go around and learn as much as I could. And it was quite interesting because pretty well all of them were retired. Dad would have been 80 this year. In June this year, he would have turned 80. So, most of his colleagues or friends were around the 70 plus mark. And they did have a lot of time on their hands. And some of them would bring out notes or show me photos or, and they really loved that opportunity to feel like they were able to fill a void for me and actually tell me. And they were quite, I suppose, chuffed and privileged to share those stories. And, a lot of them were just so pleased that I reached out and contacted them.
Yeah, and I suppose like no one would have asked them these questions before, so it was a chance maybe for them to get a bit of healing as well as you.
Oh, absolutely. There was quite a few that they got quite emotional. They got, and there was me comforting them. Um, People sort of say to me, "Don't know how you could do it," but it was sort of like, I think we can all put a different hat on at times. And I put the hat on that my role was to go and source enough information to capture that person's story for their chapter. And so I may have been emotional perhaps afterwards on my drive home, or what our system was. I would go and meet with someone or two or three, and then every couple of weeks I would catch up with the co-author, Greg Mayfield. And Greg, being the journalist, I would sit and read from my notes, and he still does with his biro shorthand. So he would shorthand everything I told him, and then he would add expression and flair, and then he would write that chapter. So sometimes it was probably when I was relaying what I knew or what I'd learned to Greg, was probably when I would become emotional, when it really sunk in what I'd learned from that person, rather than me becoming a bit of a blubbering mess while I was with the person I was interviewing.
Yeah, right. And I suppose that was it helpful then having that other person who was responsible for the writing side of things?
Yeah, it was, because it's sort of, I felt that it was just meant to be. It was something that was meant to happen. It came out of nowhere, and Greg had notes and files of everything around Dad's death at the time. And so he probably had a better understanding of it all than me. And I was out really the face of the family, if you like, asking the questions. And then he was the journalist. I think if it was the reverse, a lot of them wouldn't have been as comfortable opening up to a journalist or to the media. So I was sort of the face that would go and build the rapport, and they would recognise me as being one of Whit's daughters.
Yeah.
That they couldn't wait to fill me with stories and jokes and good times and hard times. And, you know, a lot of them tried to explain to me or give me some understanding of the why. Why did he take his life, and why was that the best decision for him at the time? So they were trying to sort of leave me with the sense of peace or closure.
Yeah. Okay. And it sounds like the people that you spoke to had a really good reaction to the project of writing the book. But one thing that sometimes concerns people is the reactions of other people when they get their story out there. How did your family feel about you writing this book and publishing it in such a public way?
Well, it's a good question, Heidi, because when I first met with this editor / reporter, so he previously worked for big newspapers, including the Advertiser and the Australian, et cetera, et cetera. And I called Mum and I said, look, Mum, I've had an idea, and I hope you're comfortable with this, but for me to create my own story and my own memories of Dad, I don't have any memories of losing him or how old I was at 9 of a lot of family memories. And I said, I really only remember what you've all told me. And so I'd love to go and interview people and write this book. And she said, oh, that sounds lovely. And then I sort of mumbled out, and it's with the reporter, Greg Mayfield, because I knew that he had been one of many that had, you know, I suppose Mum felt had stalked the family and had followed us around and had tried to interview her, and at the time of Dad's death. So she'd never forgotten the name Greg Mayfield. So she was sort of a bit taken back, going, are you going to do this with who? Are you kidding? And because she saw him as a pesky reporter. And slowly over the time of us writing the book, she came to know that, you know, there was no malice and there was no intent for him to upset her back in 1981. At the time, he was doing his job as a journalist. So she warmed to that. And my sisters, so I got sort of the support of all of them before I committed to anything. And they probably didn't really know what it was going to include, and nor did I really. We didn't know where it would take us. But one thing that it did do is I decided that I wanted to go and personally write as close to each word as I could of my two sisters and my mum's stories. So we all met at Mum's place on one particular day on a Sunday, and we just sat out the back, and one at a time I just sat and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and it was quite emotional. And I suppose it made us consciously aware that we'd never sat, the four of us, and actually talked about that horrid day and where we were when we got the news and how each of us were feeling and how we dealt with it. And so it sort of made us pause and think, oh, shivers, in 38 odd years, we've actually never sat as a family and just talked about it with the four of us about what that felt like to go through those traumatic days, weeks, months. So it was, I think it brought us all quite close together in that we learned a bit about each other
Yeah,
and why we are how we are.
sounds like a really good opportunity for kind of healing, like you're forced to actually be open and talk about it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I suppose the other question that I have, really interested in the whole process of writing a lived experience story and what kind of comes after it. When it was finally published, you get it out in the open and you can't take it back. So what was that kind of experience like for you after it was published?
Yeah, so it was a fairly easy read for people. So most people say that they got into it and they loved it and they would knocked it over easily within a week. Some people that were avid readers would say they'd read it in a weekend because it was very short stories, if you like. So there would be a story from one of the family, and then there'd be a story from one of the partners and that Dad worked with, and then there might be a story from one of the blokes that used to drink at one of the local pubs with. So there was different perspectives of people that were in his life, and a lot of people would perhaps connect with a particular part of the book that they remembered Dad as. So if they were police, they were really interested in the police. And look, we got really good feedback from people saying, "Oh, it must have been terrible," and you're so brave to share your story. And because part of my story was, and I'd learned this through going and formally being taught how to write and share a lived experience. And the first time that I actually told the story, which was way before the book, I talked about what it felt like to grow up as a child and all the different stages of my life and how Dad's decision impacted them. And anything from, looking after your mum and trying to prevent any chaos at home, to being very organised, to growing up very quickly, going and working part-time to support mum financially at a young age while I'm schooling, and right through to those milestones like weddings, grandchildren, joining the police force like Dad, taking out the ducks, those sort of things that you would give anything in the world to have your dad there. And I shared that story the first time in front of a group where we were all writing our lived experience, so they all had some experience with suicide. And I talked about just what a void had left in my life and how you grew up feeling like you weren't worthy. And what I meant with that was, it really hit me hard when I brought my child home from hospital. And like that was 23 years ago. And I still remember that day. That was probably my biggest meltdown ever, to look at this child and think I've brought life into this world and there's nothing that will ever stop me from being here for them. And that probably made me realise, I was angry. I was quite pissed that my dad had made that decision, that he too would have brought children home from hospital as newborns and basically pledged to them that he'd be there forever. And it wasn't fair. So I shared that story of how much I resented my dad and how much it had impacted my life. And it was when I went to sit down after telling this story that one of the guys sort of came forward to me and he grabbed me and he said, "Look, you've just saved my two young daughters from losing their dad." And I'd never really felt it through their eyes. I always thought I'd be doing them a favour, and you've made me look at it from a different perspective. And it was that point, Hayley, that I thought I need to share this. This is something that I don't know that I consciously hadn't heard anyone else do it, through the child's eyes, talking about hearing that news that day right through to today and all the things that it had impacted. And then the other side of the book is there were some people that were annoyed because they were like, "Why didn't you ask me? I was a really good mate of his. I worked at this division, and I didn't know." And a lot of police go quietly in retirement. They're not on social media. They're not necessarily going to reunions or these sort of things. So I was bound to overlook a few, but I had a particular 80-year-old that called me. And said he was really disappointed and hurt that he wasn't asked to be in that book. And that's just, you roll with the punches, because there was never an intent. And I made sure that I explained that to him. But you could take it as a compliment, I suppose, that he thought that Dad was such a good bloke. They had such a respect for each other because he was one of Dad's bosses. not directly though, in another team. So I just hadn't linked him to Dad's career at the time. But I learned afterwards that he was somebody that Dad spoke to not long before all of this came to a head. So yeah, I learned a lot after publishing the book about how different people perceive things, and the the wins and the learns.
Yeah. It sounds like you need to do a second round of the book, part 2 or something, and collect up all the other stories that got
Yeah,
missed.
well, the book was just the start of so many other things. So I think there could be a book 2. And one of the things that we don't have going for us, I suppose, is time's not on our hands. So that gentleman I just referred to, he only passed away just around Christmas time. So yeah, some of these people we missed our opportunity.
Mm. Well, yeah, that's all the questions that I really had. It's been in our previous conversations and in this conversation, really interesting to hear about the process that you went through, and I've never heard of anyone going and interviewing people and collecting stories like you have after someone has died by suicide. Normally, you get the biography, autobiography, memoir kind of story, but yeah, really interesting approach that you took with the book. Was there anything else that you kind of wanted to say before we wrap up today?
I think there's a couple of things that stuck with me, and um, everyone's got hindsight when it comes to suicide. I knew this, I wish that, I whatever. So one of the things that we've always known was that Dad wasn't a very outwardly, verbally emotional or loving sort of. He was a bloke's bloke, and so that morning, I don't remember it, but apparently he made a special effort to go around a kitchen table and say goodbye to everyone, and told us all how much he loved us and gave us a hug. And they were the things that we'd never really spoken about as a family, and that's some of that detail that came out that's quite reassuring. But one of the well, actually, there's 2 other stories. There was a retired boss. I think he ended up a superintendent, and him and Dad had actually done the commissioned officers course together, and they were both approached by seniority to become bosses, and they had to go through a selection process. So at the time, they were both detectives in Adelaide, and then they would have to go and do a course. And neither of them were sure if they wanted to go down that path at all with their careers, because they loved being one of the boys and not having that pressure and that seniority and that divide, if you like. So they made a pact that they would toss a coin, and this was the story that this other detective told me years later, that if it's heads, they'd do the boss's course, and if it was tails, they wouldn't. And it flipped heads and they did it. And he said to this day he wished that coin flip had been differently, because he believes his mate would still be here. And I probably didn't realise the impact and until he said to me that in retirement, he loved sailing, and he'd had a yacht built and he'd called his yacht Whit. Now, they're the stories that if I hadn't have asked, I would never know. There was another one who is part of a big cancer fundraiser in Canberra, actually, and he's been a volunteer of the big stage show. And he had, and now his name escapes me, but John, who sings True Blue, on stage for a country night, and he asked to dedicate True Blue on stage with this massive audience, and they dedicated the song to Whit. They're all the little things that are just so, you want to bottle them, because it wasn't all doom and gloom going through this process. There was a lot of good things that came out of it, and a lot of things. It turned it more than evened up the scale of resentment and anger to pride and being loved, and really accepting that he was a good bloke, and that it just got too much. So it weighed up a lot of those unanswered questions, I suppose, and reassured me that he did love us all. It's just there was a number of circumstances that we may never know exactly why, but my goal was for not just me, but for my family to find out the whole story of who Dad was, not just what we knew as a husband and a dad. And I felt like we accomplished that.
Yeah, and that's something that not many people get the opportunity to do, to hear from stories from so many different people. Yeah, we have the funerals, and then that's it. We put that person kind of to bed, I suppose, and then just think about them privately. But yeah, speaking about them so publicly, that sounds like a pretty truly special thing.
Yeah, and we made quite I suppose a positive. We did a book launch in a touristy spot called Harndorf, and where we grew up in the Adelaide Hills, Dad and a lot of his detective mates, they would drink at the local at a place called the Harndorf Inn. And there's just a lovely family there. And Dad was good mates with the brothers that ran the pub. And they still have now a restaurant across from that pub in Harndorf. And their kids now run that restaurant, and they're still very heavily involved. And so they allowed us to use the big function room there with their family. And we brought everyone together that had been either a part of the book or had supported our family over all these years. So family, friends, friends of Dad's and his former colleagues all came together there on a Sunday, and we did a book launch. I dedicated the book to Mum, because she's just a trooper for, bringing her three girls up the way she did. And we were able to share some funny stories. We had a few speeches, had a few drinks, had some live music, and tried to keep it really upbeat and celebrate. We all know that funerals, just by natural cause, can be, pretty devastating and upsetting for everybody. And I felt like that's not the way that he needed to be remembered anymore. Suicide had always been something that wasn't spoken about, and it wasn't, I suppose people didn't admit to it. They didn't want to use the words or try and explain it. So there was a lot of things in how the police force pretty well didn't acknowledge it, didn't want to recognise it, and still don't to a degree. And that was our opportunity to remember him as a good bloke without any labels or tags or putting him into a particular sector for how he died. Everybody's going to die some way, and that was his way. And we were able to come together and have a really good afternoon and bring all those people together that had created the book and had got around our family. So it ended up really positive.
Yeah, sounds like it. So lots of people who have lived experience want to write a book or record their story in a more permanent way. Do you have any advice for people who might be going down the path that you went down? Something you wish you knew before you started?
I don't. It wasn't as difficult as I thought. We self-published, which meant pretty much we put the whole transcript together. We had help with the design team through self-publishing. So there's still a business that you go through, but they help people to publish their own. Reason being, a lot of the bigger companies that publish, you need to have a minimum quota, a minimum supply of books for them to actually accept you as a customer to start with. We had no idea how many books we'd sell. It wasn't it wasn't based on economics, the decision to write this book. We didn't want to make money out of it. We didn't care about the dollars, but we wanted to do it as easily, as quickly, as efficiently, with us having control of how it's done and what's in it. And so we would basically go down to this place in Adelaide, and we had all of our photos, and it was all laid out. We got to say, well, what about if that photo went there on that angle, and we put that heading there? And it was like designing a room. You just designed what was your theme, what blocks do you want, what font do you want, and it really came together quite easily, to the point that we sent it off to a place where they print it, and then every time we wanted another, it was like a 50 book minimum, we would order another 50 books. We ended up having it in a number of Angus and Robertson stores, a number of privately owned bookshops, and now it's just on Amazon online, and people can read it themselves as an ebook. So it was a lot. I would have thought at the start, oh my goodness, publishing a book, where do you start? But it really was quite an easy process. And I think with the digital world we live in, a lot of things were edited automatically, suggestions made with grammar, all of that stuff was done for us. The interesting part came, though, when you start talking about, so we sold probably 700-800 books initially.
Wow.
And then we got to the point where we're saying, well, do we need to keep ordering 50 when we know we only need 5? And so we would say to people, look, you can go on Amazon, and instead of getting the book for $25 from us, you can order on Amazon for about 12. And they were like, a lot of them were older generation. Oh, no, I need something to hold in my hands, and I need to turn that page. So it was a physical habit that they were like, I don't want to hear what you're saying about any Amazon site. I need a hard copy. So that sort of was a little bit tricky, because we thought, oh, we'll just go almost like the QR code, just go down that line and people can just upload it to their phone. And we still had different sort of customers, if you like, that have their different preferences. But yeah, I suppose I learned, I don't know how I would do it differently in those people that felt like they were overlooked. As I said, that was a bit disappointing afterwards for us to feel that we'd left someone out. But a lot of the retired police are like any old cliquey group, that some wouldn't speak fondly of others, or some would make assumptions that he wouldn't want a bar of it. And at times, I suppose I listened to that, and maybe I should have kept pushing to contact other people to make sure that everybody was given the opportunity. But I sort of look back now and think, where would that have stopped? Because you just don't know when's enough. And there was a few, to be honest, that I didn't actually print everything they wanted me to print in the book, because they were just very much about them. And it wasn't the angle that we were trying to come from. Of course, we included them, but they might not have got to talk quite as long as what they would have hoped. But yeah, I'd say to anybody, have a go, that you've got nothing to lose. It certainly didn't cost us anything in money. It was just time.
Okay. Yeah, great. Well, that's probably a good spot to leave it on. I'm definitely inspired to go and write my book. It's something that I've considered, writing a memoir. I think we all like to think of ourselves as something that people would be interested to learn about. But yeah, it sounds like it was a really cool experience. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to share it with me, and to share it with others who might be coming across the video.
Thanks, Hayley. And just a leading note, it was John Williamson that sang True Blue. So okay. For your older audience, I am over 50 now, so I have my memory problems every now and again. But Yeah. Thank you for today. It was great, and as I said, it's it is very soothing when you can meet other people, and that my motto in life now is we've all got our story, and no two stories are going to be the same. But if you take that first layer off and dig a bit deeper, a lot of times you'll learn things about people that unless you ask the questions, you would never know. And that's what I did. I just went and asked a lot of questions.
So there you have it. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're thinking a little bit deeper about the way that lived experience works in suicide prevention. I hope to see you again for another one of these videos. And if you like what you've seen today, engage with us on social media, comment. Let's start a discussion about how we improve lived experience engagement in suicide prevention.